Hello, I'm Grindle. Welcome to SciFi MineCart, the show that digs up sci-fi that no longer gets, or has never gotten the attention it deserves, and attempts to bring it back into the light. Today we're having a look at a generic, but rather enjoyable independent film from the 1960s that may well have gone on to inspire a classic. Cue title card. The Phantom Planet is a 1961 independent sci-fi film about a phantom planet. What, you might well wonder, exactly makes a planet phantom? Well, no, it's not that it wears purple lycra and appears in the newspaper funny pages, but instead that it's sometimes there and is sometimes not. This is largely because the Phantom Planet itself is actually pilotable and is therefore moved around by the populace that live on it in a never-ending attempt to avoid the Solarites, a fire-based species that are hunting them down for the very technology that allows them to avoid them. For the record, we're told that the Solarites only want this technology to avoid being sucked into the sun.
For generations, they've been after our universal gravity control because they want to avoid being pulled into the sun.
So really they're doing it out of survival, so they're probably not actually the bad guys. I mean, if the people of the Phantom Planet just actually shared their technology, then the Solarites wouldn't have to worry about being sucked in the sun, and so they wouldn't constantly be attacking the Phantom Planet wouldn't be worried about getting blown up, and therefore the Phantom Planet wouldn't have to be constantly moving to avoid the Solarites, and then it would be far less phantom. But hey, I suppose hindsight is 20/20, except not really, because at no point in the movie do they realize just how stupid their situation is. We are, though, of course, getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, so let's rewind and talk about what the story is. The story follows the adventure of Frank Chapman, who finds himself marooned on an alien planet.
My name is Frank Chapman. 2 words.
Oh, I do apologize, although I'm not the only one who made that mistake.
You're a strange one, Frank Chapman.
And I'm not sure why she made that mistake, because he first introduced himself while she was present as Chapman, Frank Chapman, so if anything she should have mistakenly called him Chapman Frank Chapman, not Frank Chapman. But whatever, let's stop going down this rabbit hole because I'm getting vastly off topic. While investigating 2 missing spaceships and reports of a phantom planet, Chapman Frank Chapman finds his spaceship pulled into the mysterious phantom planet, which, by the way, looks like a KFC crispy strip, by a beam of concentrated gravity. At first, he's much larger than the people of the Phantom Planet, which strongly reminded me of that Twilight Zone episode about the little people. The little people. Although, unfortunately, unlike the Twilight Zone episode The Little People, Chapman Frank Chapman quickly shrunk down to the size of the populace of the Phantom Planet. This was pretty disappointing, because I think it would have been a far more interesting movie if he had stayed giant. Also, the reason we're told that he shrunk is because the gravity and oxygen on this planet is different from Earth, which I think is a total cop-out. What follows him shrinking is a pretty generic sci-fi story about a fish out of water who finds himself between 2 warring factions, and just so happens to side with the one that he first saw, which was, as I've indicated, a pretty questionable decision because as far as morality goes, they're a pretty shady species. It's kind of disappointing they went for this route, because the fish out of water caught between 2 warring factions that he's just encountered is a pretty darn generic story that appears countless times throughout B-grade sci-fi films from the 1950s and 60s. It could have just as easily been the Underwater Kingdom or Buck Rogers, but if he had remained giant, it would have, amongst independent sci-fi films from the era, been pretty darn unique. It did, however, in its credit, come out less than 3 months before the Twilight Zone episode The Little People, and hold some undeniable similarities with it, so I wouldn't be surprised in the least if it somewhat inspired Rod Serling, which is pretty darn impressive. Now, I have said, several times in fact throughout this video, that the film is, following this initial part, relatively generic. And while that is true, it's not necessarily a bad thing. You see, much like when you sit down to watch an 80s slasher film, when you sit down to watch an independent sci-fi film from the 1950s or 60s, there's a very particular kind of movie that you're hoping to see. And even if the one that you're watching doesn't do anything too groundbreaking, as long as it does do what it's trying to do well, it can still be very enjoyable. And The Phantom Planet is an exceptionally good example of a B-grade 1960s sci-fi film. To begin with, the storyline, while I've bagged it a little bit, is at least a little bit more complicated and a little bit more in-depth than is your norm from this kind of film. Rather than it just being about defeating the aliens, the Solarites, or it just being about getting home, it's about both of these, while there's also a B story about the main character Chapman Frank Chapman's people trying to find him also. All three of these storylines merge well and leave you overall satisfied, which is more than I can say for some of the other films that I've reviewed on this channel. Don't get me wrong, there are annoying unnecessary tropes, for instance the completely pointless love triangle that adds nothing to the story and doesn't really go anywhere. But to balance that out, we do have the wonderful horror trope of a monster carrying a girl away, so I feel like it washes out. The prop sets, costumes and effects are at the very least above average, and at times are darn impressive. For an independent sci-fi film from the early 60s, this one's really punching above its weight. And while it's entirely coincidental, I can't help but point out that while the Solarites are doing their attack runs, they sound an awful lot like TIE fighters. The film could have definitely been better. For instance, he could have stayed big the entire time, and even with him shrinking down, there could have been less focus on the terrible alien character who he befriends, the terrible alien character's love interest who is also just boring and awful, and the pointless rushed story arc between Frank Chapman and his love interest. But despite all of this, I still found myself thoroughly enjoying the film. Throughout most of the film, it feels a lot like a 1940s serial. The start of the film, as I said, has a pretty strong Twilight Zone feel going to it, and there are scenes, the gladiatorial combat scene for example, that had a pretty serious Star Trek vibe. Overall, it's a well-paced, visually interesting sci-fi film that stands as a good example of the genre during that era. And so if you're into retro sci-fi, The Phantom Planet is definitely worth checking out. Thanks for watching, and as always, until next time, I have been and still am Grindle.